Imagine inheriting a world your grandparents would not recognize. The animals they hunted are thinning and disappearing. The open land they navigated by is closing into forest. The coastline they camped along is retreating inland each decade. You have not moved. The world is moving around you, faster than knowledge can be updated, faster than the old stories still make sense. This is Britain at the opening of the Mesolithic. Not a fresh start, but a transformation in progress, and the people living through it have no choice but to keep up or perish. Around 11,700 years ago, the last ice age ends permanently. Temperatures across Britain rise sharply within decades, fast by any geological measure. The permafrost that has locked the ground solid begins softening. Rivers run faster and fuller. Spring arrives earlier each year and summer lingers longer. The cold that defined 30,000 years of human life in Britain is retreating northward, and in its wake, the land is rewriting itself from the ground up. The people standing in this changing world are the direct heirs of Britain's Ice Age population. The hunter-gatherers who survived the glacial maximum, who came back after the Younger Dryas cold reversal, who built a way of life in the cold open steppe that was as sophisticated and complete as any human culture on Earth. If you want their full story, who they were, what they hunted, what they believed, how they lived through 30,000 years of ice, that story is told in the first video in this series. This video begins where that one ends. At the moment, the permanent warming starts, and everything those people knew begins changing. The first visible sign of the transformation is birch. It is the pioneer tree of post-glacial landscapes across the northern world, adapted to thin soil and short seasons, able to root in ground that nothing taller could yet tolerate. Within a few generations of the warming, birch is spreading up valley floors and lower hillsides across southern Britain. It grows fast and it grows dense, shading out the low, open ground plants beneath it, trapping moisture, building soil, laying the foundation for the mixed woodland that will eventually cover most of the island. The open steppe that defined Britain for tens of thousands of years is being eaten, tree by tree, from the ground up. For the hunters, the closing forest changes the terms of survival almost immediately. The inherited strategies of the Upper Paleolithic depend on open ground, long sight lines, the ability to spot herds moving at distance, interception points where animals funnel into killable positions. As the birch thickens, those advantages disappear. The great herds that once moved predictably across the plain fragment into smaller groups threading through woodland cover. Hunting them requires different instincts, different tools, and a quality of knowledge that nobody in Britain has yet fully built. The forest is the new world. Learning to read it is the first challenge. The animals that defined the old world are leaving with it. Reindeer, among the most reliable prey animals through the cold periods, follow the retreating tundra northward and disappear from Britain within a few centuries of the warming. See, wild horse contracts eastward as open ground shrinks and fades from the British record. The woolly mammoth, depleted through decades of hunting pressure and habitat loss, makes its final appearances in Britain early in this period. The megafauna world, every animal these people's ancestors ever hunted at scale, is ending, and the people living through it are watching it happen in real time, generation by generation, with no way to know where the bottom is. What replaces it is not emptiness, and this matters. The warming foresting landscape is biologically richer in total than the cold steppe it replaces, just productive in different places and in different ways. Red deer thrive along the new woodland edges. Roe deer, a forest species with no equivalent role in the Paleolithic, begin appearing. Wild boar move into the expanding forest, rooting for the mast and tubers that broadleaf woodland produces in abundance. Aurochs, enormous wild cattle standing nearly 6 feet at the shoulder, push into Britain from the continent across Doggerland, following the spread of open woodland grassland. The New World is full. The problem is learning how to harvest it. The people facing this challenge carry 30,000 years of accumulated knowledge. How to start fire in wet conditions, how to process hide, how to track, how to navigate, how to read weather. None of that becomes useless overnight. What changes is the specific applied layer, which animals behave how in woodland cover, which new plants are edible and when, how to move through forest without being heard, how to interpret signs that an open country hunter never needed to read. That specific knowledge has to be built from scratch, from direct observation across generations of trial and learning. The inheritance is real. The work ahead is equally real. The seasonal round that organized life in the Upper Paleolithic, largely dictated by the movements of large herds across open ground, begins reorganizing around a more diverse and place-specific rhythm. The forest edge in spring, where deer are drawn to new growth. The rivers in early summer, where fish runs begin. The coast, where shellfish beds offer reliable calories without the risk of large game hunting. The hazel woodland in autumn, where nut harvests can sustain a band through weeks of intensive gathering. The year becomes more complex, more varied, and anchored to specific places rather than long, linear migrations. A different kind of knowledge, deeper, more local, more precisely calibrated to a particular piece of land, begins accumulating. Doggerland is still here. At the opening of the Mesolithic, the Great Plain connecting Britain to continental Europe is intact and inhabited, the most productive part of the human landscape in this corner of the world. Its rivers teem with fish. Its lake margins draw waterfowl in numbers that dwarf anything on the higher ground of Britain. Its mix of wetland and open woodland supports the same prey animals now spreading into Britain itself. The people living there are not living on the margins. They are living at the center, on land that has sustained human life for longer than any story reaches. The sea is rising, but the change is slow enough that no one alive feels alarmed. That reckoning is coming, but not yet. This is where this video begins, with a people in the middle of the most dramatic transformation their world has ever undergone, carrying everything their ancestors learned, rebuilding everything their ancestors knew in a landscape that will not stop changing long enough for any single generation to feel fully settled. What they build across the next 4,000 years. The knowledge, the tools, the culture, the relationship with a forested island world is one of the most complete and quietly extraordinary adaptive achievements in all of British prehistory. How they do it and what their lives actually look like is what this video is about. Birch comes first. Within a few generations of the permanent warming, and it is spreading up valley floors and lower hillsides across Britain, thin-trunked, fast-growing, rooting in ground that nothing taller could yet tolerate. Then, pine follows on the higher and drier ground, forming dense stands across much of the north and east. Then, hazel pushes into the birch stands, its dense, shrubby growth creating a layer of cover beneath the taller trees. Then, oak, elm, and lime begin establishing in the richer lowland soils of the south. The process takes centuries, and it is uneven, different in every valley and hillside, but the direction is constant. Britain is becoming a forested island. By around 9000 BCE, up to 90% of Britain's land surface is covered in some form of woodland. The open mammoth steppe that defined this landscape for tens of thousands of years exists only in the imagination of anyone old enough to have heard stories about it. The world that was flat and visible and readable for miles in every direction is now a world of close cover, of dappled light and deep shadow, of sounds that carry differently and sight lines that end at the nearest stand of trees. Everything about how you move through a landscape, how you find food in it, how you stay safe in it. All of it changes when the forest closes around you. The animals changing alongside the landscape are the clearest signal of how complete the transformation is. Reindeer are gone from Britain within centuries of the permanent warming, following the retreating tundra northward into Scandinavia. See, wild horse disappears eastward as the open ground it depends on shrinks. In their place arrive the animals of the woodland world. Red deer threading through the forest edge, roe deer, smaller, solitary, a species with no equivalent role in the Paleolithic, moving through the denser cover. Wild boar root through the leaf litter of the new deciduous woodland. Elk wade the expanding river margins and lake edges. Aurochs, the enormous wild cattle of the post-glacial world, graze the woodland clearings and the open ground along watercourses. Hunting these animals is a fundamentally different problem from hunting horse or reindeer on open ground. The large prey animals of the Paleolithic were herd animals, predictable in their movements, interceptable at river crossings and valley mouths, and visible from distances that gave hunters time to plan and position. The woodland animals of the Mesolithic are mostly solitary or move in small family groups. They use cover. They are alert to sound in ways that open country animals, whose primary defense is distance, never needed to be. Getting close enough to kill one requires a quality of woodland stealth, of reading disturbed vegetation and listening to the particular silence that an alert deer produces, that the old hunting tradition simply does not contain. The Toolkit responds. The defining technology of the Mesolithic, the innovation that marks the transition from the Paleolithic as clearly as any single object, is the microlith. These are tiny, precisely made flint blades, some no larger than a fingernail, shaped into geometric forms: triangles, crescents, trapezoids. They are hafted in rows into wooden or bone shafts using pine resin as adhesive, creating composite tools, arrows, spears, cutting edges, whose individual components can be replaced when they break without discarding the whole weapon. The engineering logic is sound and elegant. One broken flint in a composite arrow costs seconds to replace. In the Paleolithic, a broken spear point could cost hours. The bow almost certainly arrives in Britain during this period, though direct evidence, wood decays, is rare. The microlith makes most sense as an arrowhead component, and the woodland context makes the bow and arrow the most practical hunting weapon available. A thrown spear requires a longer approach, more open ground, and more physical exposure at the moment of release. An arrow loosed from behind cover, from a distance of 30 or 40 yards, gives the hunter an advantage that the forest makes possible for the first time. The prey animals of the new woodland have never been hunted by anything that kills at distance from concealment. Their instincts have not been shaped by it. For a generation or two, that gap is an advantage. But the people using these tools are not simply adapting reactively to a world that changed around them. The pollen record from across Britain tells a more active story. Charcoal layers preserved in lake sediment cores, analyzed at sites from Dartmoor to the North York Moors, show recurring episodes of localized burning during the Mesolithic. The pattern is not random. Burns occur at woodland edges in upland areas where hazel is common. And they are followed in the pollen record by expansions of open ground and shrubby vegetation, exactly the kind of habitat that attracts deer and other grazing animals. These people are not just hunting the forest. They are managing it, using fire to create the open edges and clearings that concentrate their prey where they can be taken. Fire management of woodland is a sophisticated intervention. It requires understanding how different tree species respond to burning. Hazel, notably, regenerates aggressively from burnt stumps, producing dense new growth that both feeds deer and produces the nut harvests that become one of the most important plant foods of the Mesolithic. It requires knowing how fire behaves in different wind conditions and vegetation densities. It requires accepting that what you burn this season, you will not hunt through until next season, which means planning across years rather than days. The Mesolithic people burning hillsides in northern England are not acting impulsively. They are operating a land management strategy whose returns are measured in seasons. The hazel that thrives after burning deserves particular attention because it becomes one of the foundations of Mesolithic subsistence across Britain. Hazelnuts are calorie-dense, storable over winter, and produced in abundance in the right conditions. At virtually every Mesolithic site with good organic preservation, charred hazelnut shells appear in the hearth deposits, sometimes in quantities suggesting deliberate, intensive processing rather than casual snacking. A good hazel stand, managed through burning to maximize nut production, can yield enough calories in a single autumn harvest to carry a small band through weeks of winter scarcity. Knowing where the best hazel stands are, understanding when they will produce and in what quantities, and maintaining them through deliberate intervention is a form of land knowledge that begins to blur the line between hunting and gathering, and something closer to active land management. The campsites of this period reflect the changed world. Upper Paleolithic camps tend to cluster around cave systems and the open valley floors where herds moved. Mesolithic camps are found in a wider range of positions: lake edges, river margins, woodland clearings, coastal headlands, because the resource base is now more varied and more widely distributed. The archaeological signature changes too. Flint scatters at Mesolithic open-air sites are often smaller and more concentrated than Paleolithic equivalents, suggesting shorter visits and more frequent movement between a larger number of specific resource locations. The band's territory is not necessarily smaller than in the Paleolithic. It is differently organized, a network of known places rather than a long linear route following a single herd. The social world adapts alongside the practical one. Smaller, more mobile bands moving through forest cannot rely on the long sight lines that made large group coordination possible on open ground. Communication, signaling, and the maintenance of relationships across distances become more dependent on regular meeting points. The seasonal aggregation sites where multiple bands come together to exchange information, trade materials, arrange marriages, and share the knowledge that keeps everyone alive. The evidence for these gatherings appears in the archaeology as concentrations of activity that go well beyond what a single band would produce. Flint from multiple sources, structures larger than any single family would need, middens that accumulated over repeated seasonal visits. These people are not living in isolation. They are maintaining a social world across a forested landscape that requires deliberate effort to sustain. Look at a map of Northwest Europe today, and you see the North Sea, a body of water roughly the size of the British Isles themselves, and separating Britain from the Netherlands, Denmark, and Germany by hundreds of miles of open water. The sea is new. 10,000 years ago, almost none of it existed. In its place was land, Doggerland, a vast lowland plain of braided rivers, shallow lakes, dense wetlands, and wooded hills stretching from the east coast of Britain all the way to the coasts of what are now Norway, Denmark, and the Netherlands. It was not a marginal landscape. By every measure available to us, it was the richest human environment in all of northwestern Europe. At its peak, Doggerland covered an area comparable in size to Britain itself. Major river systems drained it from all sides, the Proto-Thames flowing in from the west, the Rhine and Meuse from the east, joining into a great combined river that ran southwest toward the Atlantic. The landscape these rivers created was precisely the kind that Mesolithic people thrived in. An endlessly varied mosaic of wetland and dry ground, of forested valleysides dropping to lake margins and river floodplains, rich in fish, waterfowl, red deer, wild boar, and aurochs. A landscape archaeologist at the University of Bradford, Professor Vince Gaffney, who has spent decades mapping it using seismic survey data, describes it plainly as potentially the heartland of Mesolithic Europe. The people who lived on it were not living at the edges of the human world. They were living at its center. The seabed of the North Sea preserves what the land has long since erased. Fishing trawlers working these waters have been pulling up prehistoric artifacts for over a century. Flint tools, barbed antler harpoon points, animal bones, and fragments of human remains dragged up in nets from the seafloor. One of the most significant early finds was a beautifully made red deer antler barbed point pulled from the water off the Norfolk coast in 1931. Dated later to around 13,000 years ago, it was the first human tool from the North Sea studied scientifically, and it opened the question that archaeologists have been pursuing ever since. What else is down there? The answer, accumulated through decades of seismic survey and, more recently through deliberate underwater excavation, is remarkable. The seabed preserves river channels, lake basins, ancient coastlines, and peat beds, the compressed remains of Mesolithic wetlands, in conditions of oxygen-free preservation that keep organic material intact for thousands of years. Wooden tools, plant remains, and an animal bone have all been recovered in the states of preservation that would be impossible on dry land. At one site off the Dutch coast, a set of human footprints, up to 39 individual prints in a single trackway, were found preserved in ancient estuarine mud. Someone walked there. Someone left their weight in the ground. The ground kept it. The sea level rise that would eventually erase all of this was already underway from the moment the permanent warming began. During the peak of the last glacial maximum, global sea levels sat roughly 120 meters lower than today, with vast quantities of water locked in the ice sheets. As those sheets melted across the early Holocene, the water had to go somewhere, and it went into the oceans. The rate was not constant. It spiked during periods of rapid ice sheet collapse and slowed between them, but the direction never reversed. Across the period covered by this video, sea level rise averaged roughly 1 to 2 meters per century. That is enough to drown a flat coastal plain by several kilometers per generation in the lowest lying areas. For the people living on Doggerland, this is not an abstraction. It is the texture of their lives across generations. A fishing camp used in one generation sits closer to the water's edge in the next. A valley that drained reliably in a grandparent's time floods each spring and eventually does not drain. A stretch of low ground that was productive hazel woodland becomes salt marsh, then open water. No individual alive during this period witnesses the full arc of Doggerland's loss. It unfolds across centuries and millennia, not lifetimes. But every generation inherits a slightly smaller world than the one before it. And every generation must adapt its seasonal patterns, its camp locations, its understanding of the landscape to a geography that is shifting beneath them. The archaeological evidence for this adaptive pressure appears in the radiocarbon record from sites around the North Sea basin. A 2024 study modeling the inundation history of Doggerland against archaeological radiocarbon dates found elevated activity rates in northwest Germany and the Netherlands around 10,500 to 10,000 years ago. Precisely the period when inundation models show significant area loss in the southern Doggerland lowlands. People were not simply retreating passively. The evidence suggests population movement and cultural change accelerating in direct response to the landscape disappearing. The flooding was driving behavior in ways measurable in the archaeological record 3,000 years before the final severance. The wetlands themselves, as they expanded under the rising water, were not simply hostile. Wetland edges are among the most productive environments available to hunter-gatherers, rich in fish, waterfowl, aquatic plants, and the large mammals drawn to drink and graze along the margins. As Doggerland's rivers widened into estuaries and its low ground became lake and marsh, the resource base shifted rather than simply contracted. People followed that shift, establishing camps on the higher ground overlooking the expanding wetlands, exploiting the new ecology of the margins with the same opportunism that had characterized their response to every previous environmental transition. The barbed antler harpoon points recovered from the North Sea seabed are the tools of people who were fishing the expanding waters, not fleeing them. By around 9000 BCE, a large tidal bay had formed between eastern England and what remained of the Dogger Bank uplands to the east. The continuous plain was already broken. Doggerland was fragmenting into higher ground, separated by expanding water. The Dogger Bank itself, a broad upland ridge running roughly east-west across what is now the central North Sea, was becoming increasingly isolated as the lower ground around it flooded. For the communities living on it, the question of how to maintain contact with populations on the British mainland to the west and with continental European populations to the east was becoming practically urgent in ways it had never been before. The boats that Mesolithic people were already using on rivers and coastal waters were becoming strategically essential. The Storegga Slide adds one more layer to this story, and it is a dramatic one. Around 6200 BCE, an underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, one of the largest such events in the geological record, involving a collapse of seabed roughly the size of Scotland, triggered a tsunami that struck the coastlines of the North Sea, with waves estimated at several meters high in some areas. For the remaining communities on Doggerland's higher ground, already living on the margins of a shrinking landscape, the tsunami would have been catastrophic. The evidence of the wave appears in sediment layers at multiple coastal sites around the North Sea. A distinctive layer of marine sand deposited far inland, dated consistently to around 6200 BCE. Some researchers consider the Storegga tsunami the final event that broke the last coherent Doggerland communities. Others note that the land was already so reduced by this point that the tsunami accelerated an end that was coming regardless. Both are probably right. By around 6500 BCE, some estimates place it slightly earlier, some slightly later, the last land connection between Britain and continental Europe disappears under the rising North Sea. Britain becomes an island for the first time in its history. The Dogger Bank continues to exist as an island for perhaps another 1,000 years, a remnant upland above the water before it too sinks below the surface around 5000 BCE. The people who had lived on it either left for the British or continental European mainland as conditions deteriorated, or they did not leave in time. The sea that covers it today, roughly 15 to 30 meters deep across the bank, is shallow enough that on a clear day the bottom is visible from a boat. The lost world is not far below. The full human cost of Doggerland's loss is something archaeology is still trying to measure. The genetic evidence from Britain shows a degree of isolation developing after the final severance. The Western hunter-gatherer gene pool in Britain becomes slightly more distinct from its continental counterpart across the later Mesolithic, consistent with a reduction in the gene flow that the land connection previously permitted. Trade networks that had carried Baltic amber to Somerset and continental tool technologies to Britain thin out. The social world that Doggerland had underpinned, the aggregation sites, the exchange networks, the marriages between bands on either side of what is now the North Sea, contracts with the land. Britain does not become hermetically sealed. Boats continue to cross, but the scale and ease of connection is never the same again. There is a particular quality to the loss of Doggerland that sets it apart from the other environmental changes in this video. The closing of the forest was something the people living through it could work with, adapt the tools, adapt the strategies, learn the new world. The loss of Doggerland was the loss of the world itself for the people who called it home. Not a transformation, but a submergence, the actual disappearance of the land that held the camps, the fishing grounds, the burial sites, the places where families met each season, and stories were told about how long people had been coming to this particular river bend. All of it is under the North Sea now. The people who survived moved to higher ground and rebuilt. What they lost is still there, waiting on the seafloor. 3,000 years of human life preserved in the silt. Water defines Mesolithic Britain in a way it never defined the Paleolithic. The rivers are fuller, the coastline longer and more varied than the open steppe ever was, and the lakes and wetlands expanding across the low ground offer a concentration of resources that no single woodland environment can match. These people are not primarily forest hunters who occasionally fish. They are people who have learned to read the whole landscape, forest, river, estuary, and coast, as a single interconnected system, and who move through it according to a seasonal logic that extracts the maximum from each environment at its most productive moment. The rivers are the highways and the larders simultaneously. Salmon run upstream in late summer and autumn in numbers that modern British rivers, depleted across centuries of industrial fishing, cannot hint at. Eels migrate in vast quantities through river systems each year, predictable in their timing and interceptable in ways that make them one of the most reliable food sources in the Mesolithic diet. Brown trout, pike, perch, and roach populate every river system of any size. The bone record from Mesolithic waterside sites confirms sustained, intensive fishing. Fish bones appearing in hearth deposits not as occasional dietary supplements, but as staple food, eaten repeatedly across every season of the year. The fish trap, found in the Severn estuary, excavated by a University of Reading team and featured on the BBC in 2024, is one of the most evocative pieces of Mesolithic evidence to emerge in recent years. Dated to around 7,000 years ago, now it consists of wooden stakes woven around with willow stems to create a V-shaped fence across the bed of a former river channel, a structure designed to funnel fish into a narrowing end where they could be speared or lifted out by hand. Within the same channel, low tides revealed something even more striking: hundreds of human footprints preserved in the ancient estuary mud, moving in both directions along paths connecting campsites to the trap location. Many of them belong to children, some as young as 4. This is not an abstract site. It is a place where families worked together, where children played and learned, where the daily routine of a Mesolithic community left its weight in the ground. Fish weirs and traps of this kind require planning across seasons. The stakes must be cut, shaped, eaten and woven while the river level is low enough to work in. The structure must be maintained across successive seasons or rebuilt each year. The timing of the fish runs must be known well enough in advance to ensure the band is present when the run peaks. All of this implies a relationship with specific river locations that goes beyond passing through. These are places returned to deliberately year after year within a seasonal round that is as carefully planned as any agricultural calendar. The shellfish middens are the other major signature of Mesolithic coastal life, and they exist in remarkable quantities along the western and northern coasts of Britain. The Oronze middens on the Inner Hebrides, studied in detail by archaeologist Paul Mellers, are among the most thoroughly investigated in Europe. They accumulated across several centuries of repeated seasonal use, the discarded shells of limpet, periwinkle, and oyster compressing into mounds several meters deep. Chemical analysis of the shells themselves, measuring oxygen isotope ratios that record the water temperature at the time each shell grew, shows that different middens on the same island were used in different seasons. The community was rotating around the island's coast through the year, exploiting each section of shoreline at its most productive time. Shellfish are not glamorous food by any measure, but their role in Mesolithic subsistence is more important than it appears. A limpet stripped from a rock at low tide requires no weapon, no coordination, no skill beyond knowing where the productive beds are and when to visit them. It provides protein, fat, and micronutrients in a form that is available year-round, in weather that makes other food acquisition difficult or impossible. Middens at sites like Westward Ho in Devon and along the Welsh coastline preserve the shells of dozens of species alongside fish bones, seal bones, and the occasional whale or dolphin. Evidence of people exploiting every resource the intertidal and shallow coastal zone offered, from the smallest invertebrate to the largest marine mammal. The sea mammals are worth attention. Gray seals haul out on British coasts in predictable locations at predictable times of year. Their bones appear at coastal Mesolithic sites regularly enough to confirm that sealing was a practiced, planned activity rather than an opportunistic one. A gray seal weighing 300 pounds provides not only substantial quantities of meat, but thick, waterproof hide and a quantity of blubber that, rendered into oil, serves as fuel for lamps, as waterproofing for clothing and boats, and as a high-calorie supplement to a diet that in winter can be lean on fat. In the cold and wet conditions of the British coast, blubber oil is a resource of genuine strategic importance. Boats are essential to this coastal world, and the evidence for their existence, while fragmentary, is real. A possible dugout canoe found in estuarine sediments at Hartlepool Bay in northeast England was associated with Mesolithic flints and radiocarbon dates consistent with this period, though the find was not conserved and has since been lost. A single possible paddle was identified at Starcar. We're in Denmark and the Netherlands, where waterlogged preservation conditions are better, Mesolithic logboats are confirmed finds. These are not rafts or improvised crossings. They are functional watercraft capable of coastal navigation and the exploitation of offshore resources that no land-based approach can reach. The people using them understood tides, currents, and coastal weather in ways that can only come from generations of accumulated maritime knowledge. The seasonal movement between inland and coastal environments is one of the defining rhythms of Mesolithic life in Britain, and the isotopic evidence from human bones confirms it. Studies measuring strontium isotopes, which record where a person spent different periods of their life through the signature of local geology in their teeth and bones, show individuals whose early life signatures differ from their burial location, consistent with a pattern of regular movement between distinct environments. Some individuals show signatures consistent with coastal childhood and inland adulthood, or vice versa. The movement is not random. It reflects a deliberate, multi-generational strategy of exploiting a varied landscape across its full seasonal cycle. The coastal and wetland world also shapes the social calendar in ways that the forest alone could not. In coastal aggregation points, places where multiple bands converge around rich seasonal resources are visible in the archaeology as concentrations of activity larger and more diverse than any single band would produce. The Oronce middens show evidence of this. The range of raw materials present, the variety of tool types, the scale of accumulated debris, all point to gatherings that drew people from across a wider territory. These are not just food camps. They are the meeting places where information is exchanged, where young people from different bands encounter each other, where the social fabric that connects dispersed communities is renewed and maintained. The coast in Mesolithic Britain is where people come together. in a farm field in the Vale of Pickering, North Yorkshire. Yet beneath an unassuming stretch of grassland, beside what was once the shore of a long-vanished lake, lies the most important Mesolithic site in Britain. Starcar was first identified in 1948 by an amateur archaeologist named John Moore and excavated between 1949 and 1951 by Cambridge prehistorian Graham Clark. What Clark found in the waterlogged peat, preserved by the oxygen-free conditions that waterlogged soil creates, was unlike anything previously recovered from the British Mesolithic. Not just flint tools, the near-universal survivor of prehistoric sites, but organic material, bone, antler, wood, plant remains, things that normally vanish without trace. At Starcar, they did not vanish, they waited. The flint assemblage alone is extraordinary in scale. Yet the most recent excavations recovered nearly 42,000 pieces of knapped flint from the site. Tools, waste flakes, resharpening debris, representing sustained intensive activity across a period now dated to between roughly 8,770 and 8,460 BCE, a span of around 300 years. Microwear analysis of the tools, microscopic examination of the polish and striations left by use identified traces of working antler, bone, fish, meat, hide, plant fibers, and wood. Projectile impact marks were found on microliths consistent with arrows that had hit their targets. The full range of daily life is written in the surfaces of those flints in a language that takes a microscope to read. The microlith is everywhere at Starcar, as it is everywhere in the Mesolithic, and it rewards attention. These tiny, precisely shaped flint blades, some no larger than a fingernail, struck from carefully prepared cores and shaped by fine pressure flaking into geometric forms, are the defining tool of this period. At Starcar, they were hafted using birch bark tar as adhesive, small rolls of which were found at the site. Some were used as arrow tips. The impact traces confirm it. Others formed the cutting edges of composite tools. The engineering logic is elegant. When one component breaks, it is replaced without discarding the handle or shaft. A broken microlith costs minutes to replace. In the Paleolithic, a broken spear point might cost hours. The antler-barbed points found at Starcar are remarkable in a different register. Nearly 200 of them were recovered, over 95% of the total number from all British Mesolithic sites combined. They range from 8 to 38 centimeters in length, each one shaped from red deer antler by cutting, grinding, and careful incision of the barbs. These are harpoon tips designed to penetrate and hold. The barbs prevent withdrawal once the point has entered flesh. Used for fishing in the lake beside which the site sits, and almost certainly for hunting deer and elk along the water margins, they represent a level of investment in craft that goes well beyond the minimum required for functional tools. Some are made with a care that suggests the maker was attending to something beyond pure utility. The house at Starcar deserves its own moment. Found during excavations in 2008 and dated to around 8,500 BCE, and it is the oldest known house structure in Britain, a circular arrangement of post holes roughly 5 to 6 meters in diameter, set into dry ground slightly upslope from the lake edge. It is older than the previous record holder at Howick in Northumberland by around 500 years. The structure implies a level of investment in a specific place that the word camp does not quite capture. Building a circular post-frame dwelling takes time and effort that makes sense only if you plan to return to the same location repeatedly, season after season. Starcar, for at least part of its 3-century occupation, was not a temporary stop. It was a place people came back to, a place with meaning and history built into it. The dogs at Starcar are another detail that changes the picture. Yet wolf and dog remains. The distinction between the two at this early date is difficult to establish with certainty, but some researchers have argued the Starkar finds represent domesticated dogs, were given deliberate treatment in death, buried separately from food refuse in ways that distinguish them from ordinary prey animals. If these are domestic dogs, Starkar provides some of the earliest evidence for dog-human partnership in Britain. A dog is not simply a pet in a Mesolithic context. It is a hunting tool of the first order, capable of tracking wounded prey through forest cover, of flushing game from dense undergrowth, of warning a camp of approaching predators at night. A good hunting dog changes the economics of every hunt it participates in. Then there are the headdresses. 21 of them were recovered from Starkar. The frontal bone of red deer stags with the antlers still attached, the skull carefully worked down to reduce weight, holes drilled through the bone to allow leather straps for fastening. They are the most discussed objects from the entire British Mesolithic, and the most honest answer to any question about what they meant is that we do not know with certainty. Hunting disguise is one possibility, wearing a deer skull and antlers while stalking deer on the water margin is practical enough that it cannot be dismissed. Ritual use is another. Shamanic traditions documented across Siberia and the Americas involve practitioners wearing animal headdresses to enter trance states and move between human and animal identity. The two possibilities are not mutually exclusive. Yes, a headdress worn in ritual and later worn in the hunt is still a headdress with a dual life. What the headdresses tell us, regardless of their specific function, is that the people at Starkar had a relationship with red deer that went beyond food and materials. The deer is the most frequently hunted animal at the site, the most commonly represented in the artifact assemblage, and the one whose remains received the most deliberate, non-utilitarian treatment. Its antlers became tools and ritual objects. Its skulls became headdresses. Its bones were deposited in the lake alongside flint tools in arrangements that look less like disposal and more like offering. Whatever these people believed about the world, red deer occupied a central place in it. The Starkar pendant, found in 2015, is the oldest known Mesolithic art in Britain. Yet carved from a single piece of shale into a roughly triangular form, 31 by 35 millimeters, it carries engraved lines on its surface whose meaning remains open. Proposed interpretations include a tree, a map, a leaf, and tally marks. When first found, the lines were invisible, the perforation blocked by sediment. Digital microscopy revealed them. The pendant had been worn. The perforation shows wear consistent with a cord or thong passing through it repeatedly. Someone made this object, wore it, carried it, and eventually left it at the lake edge. What it meant to them and what the lines on it recorded or represented is a question the object will not answer. It only confirms that the person who made it was thinking in symbols, in meanings that outlasted the moment of their making. Starkar is irreplaceable, and it is in danger. The waterlogged peat that preserved its organic material for 11,000 years is drying out. Agricultural drainage in the surrounding fields has raised the acidity of the groundwater, accelerating the decay of whatever organic material remains unexcavated. Recent analysis confirmed that preservation conditions have deteriorated dramatically in the last few decades. Material that survived 11,000 years of burial is being destroyed within a human generation by the changed hydrology of a modern farm landscape. What has already been recovered represents only a fraction of what the site once held and what it still holds. The race between excavation and decay is one that archaeology is not winning. In 1903, workmen improving drainage at Gough's Cave in Cheddar Gorge, Somerset, unearthed a human skeleton. It was nearly complete: skull, spine, ribs, limbs. And it belonged to a young man who died in his early 20s, around 10,000 years ago. He was roughly 5 feet 5 inches tall, in good health by the standards of his world, with well-preserved teeth showing the wear patterns of a life spent chewing through tough food and using his mouth as a third hand for gripping and working materials. He was Mesolithic, a forest hunter-gatherer living in the warm centuries after the last ice age. He is known today as Cheddar Man, and in 2018 his genome was sequenced by a team from University College London and the Natural History Museum. What they found rewrote the popular image of ancient Britain. Cheddar Man had dark to dark brown skin, dark curly hair, and blue or blue-green eyes. Yet the combination surprises most modern audiences encountering it for the first time, but it was entirely typical of the population he belonged to. Western hunter-gatherers, the broad genetic grouping that covers Mesolithic people across Western Europe from Britain to Hungary and Spain, consistently show the same profile in ancient DNA analysis, an absence of the genetic variants associated with light skin pigmentation in modern Europeans, combined with variants producing light eye color. The dark skin was not an anomaly. It was standard across the entire Western European Mesolithic population for thousands of years. The reason light skin took so long to spread into Britain has to do with diet rather than sunlight alone. The standard explanation for light skin at northern latitudes is that it allows more UV radiation to penetrate and drive vitamin D synthesis in low sunlight environments. But Mesolithic people were getting substantial vitamin D from food, oily fish, organ meats, animal fat, marine mammals, in quantities that made the dietary shortfall, which later drove strong selection for lighter skin in farming populations eating grain-heavy diets, far less acute. The selective pressure for lighter skin was genuinely weaker in people who ate the way Cheddar Man ate. It arrived with the farmers, not before them. It is worth being precise about what the genetics can and cannot say. The skin pigmentation prediction for Cheddar Man is based on known genetic markers associated with pigmentation in modern populations, and is applied to ancient DNA with limited sequencing coverage of the relevant regions. The Natural History Museum's own FAQ notes that the prediction carries uncertainty. We know with confidence that he lacked the modern European light skin variants, but the exact shade his skin would have appeared is genuinely unknown. Dark to dark brown is the most defensible characterization. Some researchers prefer intermediate. What is not defensible is the pale-skinned ancient Britain of popular imagination. That version does not survive contact with the evidence. Cheddar Man belongs to the Western hunter-gatherer lineage, specifically the Villabruna genetic cluster established in Video 1, which expanded across Western Europe from around 14,000 years ago and became the dominant ancestry across the continent through the Mesolithic. There's about 85% of his ancestry traces to this Villabruna cluster, with roughly 15% from the older Goyet-related Magdalenian ancestry. A slightly different ratio from other British Mesolithic individuals sequenced to date, whose ancestry is modeled as entirely Villabruna-related. The difference is small, but real, and it confirms that the Mesolithic population of Britain was not genetically uniform. It was a shallow pool of related but distinct lineages maintaining contact across a connected landscape. The total population of Mesolithic Britain is difficult to estimate with precision, but the available evidence, site density, resource carrying capacity of the landscape, genetic diversity, suggests somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 people across the whole island at any given time in the earlier Mesolithic, to possibly rising to higher numbers in the later period as the population adapted more fully to the post-glacial environment. That is an almost impossibly small number by modern standards, smaller than a single village, spread across an island the size of Britain. The implications for daily life are significant. These people almost certainly knew, by reputation if not personally, every other band operating within a several days' walk radius. Genuine strangers would have been rare. The social organization of these bands follows patterns visible across hunter-gatherer societies documented ethnographically worldwide. The core residential unit is a band of roughly 20 to 30 people, large enough to cooperate effectively on complex tasks like fishing weirs and large game hunting, by small enough to be sustained by the resources of a defined seasonal territory. Within the band, leadership is situational rather than hereditary. The most experienced hunter leads the hunt. The person with the deepest plant knowledge leads the gathering expedition. The most skilled toolmaker teaches the toolmaking. Authority derives from competence and is rarely absolute. Decisions affecting the whole group are made collectively through a social process that leaves no archaeological trace, but that is consistent across every documented hunter-gatherer society. The bands are not isolated units. The genetic evidence from British Mesolithic individuals shows sufficient diversity to rule out long-term inbreeding, which means gene flow between bands was regular and sustained. The mechanism is well documented ethnographically. Young people, typically in their mid-teens, move between bands as part of marriage arrangements, carrying with them not only their genes, but their knowledge, their tool traditions, and their social connections. A young woman who grows up learning to fish the estuaries of the Severn and moves to a band in Yorkshire brings with her an understanding of coastal resources that her new community may not have. A young man who learned stone knapping techniques from a craftsman in Wales carries those techniques north. Knowledge moves with people, and people move deliberately and regularly. The aggregation sites, places where multiple bands converge seasonally around rich resources, are the social hubs of the Mesolithic world. The Oransay Middens in the Inner Hebrides, discussed in the previous section, show evidence of gatherings that drew people from beyond the island's own resident population. Sites in the Vale of Pickering around Star Carr show a density and diversity of activity consistent with multi-band use over an extended period. At these gatherings, information about the state of resources across a wide territory is exchanged, tool innovations spread, disputes are resolved under the social pressure of a larger collective, and the bonds between bands are renewed through shared activity, shared food, and the particular kind of social trust that only face-to-face contact produces. These are not casual meetings. They are the infrastructure of the Mesolithic social world. The treatment of the dead in Mesolithic Britain is consistent with a population that places deep significance on the individual and on the continuity between the living and the dead. Red ochre burials, the tradition established at Paviland in the Upper Paleolithic, continue into the Mesolithic. At Avelin's Hole in Somerset, dated to around 10,200 BCE, multiple individuals were buried with ochre and what appear to be deliberate arrangements of bone. At Knockcoig on Oransay, human bones were found mixed into the midden deposits in ways that suggest deliberate placement rather than simple disposal. Secondary burial, the practice of collecting and reburying bones long after death, appears at several sites, implying a relationship with the dead that extends beyond initial interment and that involves the active curation of ancestral remains as meaningful objects. What language these people spoke is something genetics and archaeology cannot recover. Every language spoken in Britain today arrived after the Mesolithic ended. The Celtic languages, Latin, the Germanic languages that became English, all postdate the farming revolution and the subsequent population replacements. The language of Cheddar Man and his contemporaries has left no trace in any living tongue, as far as we can determine. It vanished with the people who spoke it, displaced by the languages of the farmers and the steppe herders who replaced them. What it sounded like, what it could express, what stories it carried, all of it is gone. The silence on this point is one of the most complete in all of British prehistory, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before moving on. The people these genetics describe, dark-skinned, blue-eyed, fishing the rivers of Somerset and hunting the forests of Yorkshire and gathering shellfish on the Hebridean coast, are the people of Mesolithic Britain at their fullest expression. They are not a preliminary population, not a placeholder waiting for something more sophisticated to arrive. They are the result of 4,000 years of post-glacial adaptation, the heirs of 30,000 years of human life in Britain before them, and the builders of a world that will sustain itself. Without farming, without metals, without writing, for longer than the entire span of recorded human history. What that world looks like at its most complete is what the remaining sections of this video are about. The headdresses from Starcar have been discussed in the previous section as objects of ambiguous function, hunting disguise or ritual costume, possibly both. But they deserve a second look here because a 2016 study published in PLOS One by a team from the University of York conducted the first full scientific analysis of how they were made, and the findings change what the making of them implies about the people who made them. The deer skulls were not simply dried and worn. They were processed using a specific sequence of techniques. The frontal bones were thinned using fire, flint blades, and grinding to reduce weight while preserving the antlers intact. The process required planning, skill, and knowledge of how bone responds to heat. These are not improvised objects. They were manufactured with the care and deliberateness of something that mattered. The question of what exactly they were used for remains genuinely open, and the honest position is to sit with that openness rather than collapse it prematurely. The two most commonly proposed explanations are hunting disguise and shamanic costume, and the research team behind the 2016 study notes that these are not mutually exclusive. Ethnographic parallels from Siberian cultures document practitioners wearing antler headdresses both in ritual contexts, entering trance states, moving symbolically between human and animal identity, and in practical hunting contexts where the disguise provides a genuine advantage. A single object can carry both functions across its working life. The headdresses at Starcar may have done the same. What the ethnographic parallels do suggest, carefully applied, is that the distinction between the practical and the sacred that modern Western thinking tends to impose on objects like these may not reflect how the people who made them organized their world. For a hunter-gatherer community whose survival depends on animals, the relationship with those animals is unlikely to be purely transactional. The red deer at Starcar is not simply prey. It is the central figure in a material culture that includes 200 barbed bone points, 24 skull headdresses, and animal remains deposited in the lake in arrangements that look less like disposal and more like deliberate placement. Whatever the full picture of belief at Starcar was, red deer sat at the heart of it. And burials in Mesolithic Britain are rarer than in the Upper Paleolithic, and their rarity is itself significant. One interpretation gaining traction in recent scholarship is that the scarcity of formal inhumation burials reflects a fundamentally different conception of what a person is after death. Not a body to be placed and kept in one location, but a set of remains to be circulated, distributed across meaningful places in the landscape, maintained as active presences rather than fixed memorials. Human bones at Mesolithic sites appear in arrangements that are difficult to explain as simple disposal. Mixed into midden deposits at deliberate depths, deposited in lake edges alongside flint tools, placed in caves in positions that suggest access was maintained for ongoing interaction with the remains long after death. And Paviland's hole in the Mendip Hills of Somerset provides the clearest British evidence for deliberate Mesolithic burial. The cave holds the remains of at least 50 individuals, a remarkable concentration for this period, deposited across a time span that radiocarbon dating places between roughly 10,200 and 9,600 BCE red ochre was present. The remains were disarticulated in ways consistent with secondary burial, bones collected and redeposited after initial decomposition elsewhere. The cave was used not as a place to leave the dead and walk away, but as a place to return to add to maintain a relationship with across generations. The dead at Paviland's Hole were not abandoned. They were kept. The treatment of the dead as ongoing presences rather than concluded lives appears elsewhere in the Mesolithic record. At Knock Coig on Oranse, human bones were found mixed into the midden layers at depths and in orientations that suggest deliberate placement rather than accidental inclusion. Hand bones, in particular, appear repeatedly in Mesolithic contexts in Britain and across Europe in positions that seem too specific to be incidental. Placed at the edges of hearths, deposited at lake margins, included in caches of objects that appear to have been maintained and returned to over extended periods. The hand, in many documented hunter-gatherer belief systems, carries particular significance as the most distinctively human part of the body. Whether that significance applies here is unverifiable. That the deposits were deliberate is not. The animistic worldview that most researchers attribute to Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, a framework in which the landscape is populated by presences, in which rivers, hills, forests, and specific trees are understood as persons with agency rather than as inert features, leaves traces in the archaeological record that are easy to overlook because they look like ordinary activity. A flint tool dropped into a river at a specific location where dozens of other tools have been dropped across generations. An arrangement of animal bones at a spring head that cannot be explained by butchery or disposal. A particular cave used not for habitation, but visited repeatedly, where objects accumulate without evidence of any practical function for the visits. These patterns appear across British and European Mesolithic sites. They describe a people for whom the boundary between the human world and the wider world is permeable, and for whom maintaining relationships with non-human presences is as much a part of daily life as fishing or tool-making. The antler tine found at Romsey in Hampshire, recovered during construction work in the 1930s and recently radiocarbon dated to the early Mesolithic, carries incised chevron markings along its length, a deliberate, non-functional decoration on an object made from material that is already rich in symbolic associations at Starcar and elsewhere. It is not a tool. It is an engraved object, carried or displayed or placed with intention. Alongside the Starcar pendant discussed in the previous section, it confirms that portable decorated objects, things made to be carried, worn, or placed as meaningful markers, were part of the material culture of Mesolithic Britain beyond the exceptional context of Starcar. The inner life of these people is not recoverable in full, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. What the evidence gives us are glimpses. The deliberate deposits, the worked headdresses, the ochre-stained bones, the engraved objects, the careful treatment of the dead across generations. These glimpses do not add up to a complete picture of what these people believed. They add up to a clear picture of people who believed something, who organized their relationship with the world around a set of ideas and practices that were consistent enough to leave a pattern in the material record across thousands of years of occupation. The specific content of those beliefs is gone. The fact of them is not. What these people left behind in the ground is a record of a fully developed symbolic world, one that expressed itself not in painted caves, as in the Upper Paleolithic, but in the treatment of bodies, the deliberate placement of objects, the manufacture of costume, and the maintenance of relationships with the landscape and the dead across generations. It is a quieter record than Lascaux or Altamira. It is not a lesser one. Sometime around 6,500 BCE, the last land connecting Britain to continental Europe disappears under the rising North Sea. The exact moment is unrecoverable. There is no single event, no audible crack, no visible line crossed. One season the ground is walkable, and the next it is not. And the people on either side of what is becoming a strait have no framework to understand that the separation is permanent. They have seen land flood before. They have seen it drain. They have no reason to believe that this time the water will not recede. It does not recede. Britain becomes an island, and everything that follows in its history flows from that fact. The process leading to this moment has been accumulating for over 5,000 years, since the permanent warming began at the end of the last ice age. Sea levels rising at roughly 1 to 2 meters per century have been steadily erasing Doggerland from its lowest margins inward. And by 6,500 BCE, the Great Plain that once stretched from eastern England to Denmark has already been largely lost. What remains at the moment of final severance is a narrowing land corridor in the south, the chalk ridge connecting what is now Kent to what is now Pas de Calais, and a scattering of low islands and sandbars across the southern North Sea. When the water finally overtops the chalk ridge and carves through it, the English Channel forms, and Britain's isolation begins. The Dogger Bank survives as an island for perhaps another 1,500 years after the mainland connection is severed. A remnant upland, rising above the new sea, roughly the size of Wales, sitting where the central North Sea now lies, at depths of 15 to 30 meters. Seismic surveys conducted by Professor Vince Gaffney's team at the University of Bradford have mapped its ancient landscape in detail. River valleys, lake basins, wetland margins. The topography of a world that has been underwater for 7,000 years, but that is still readable in the seafloor sediments. People almost certainly lived on the Dogger Bank Island as conditions allowed, fishing the expanding waters around it and maintaining whatever contact was still possible with the British and continental European mainlands to either side. Then, around 6,200 BCE, roughly 3 centuries after the mainland connection is severed, the Storegga Slide changes everything that remains. On the continental shelf off the coast of Norway, a submarine landslide involving an estimated 290 kilometers of coastal shelf and 3,500 cubic kilometers of debris collapses into the deep ocean. And the displacement generates a tsunami that travels south through the North Sea, with waves estimated at several meters high on open water and significantly higher at certain coastlines. The evidence of its arrival is preserved in sediment cores from sites around the North Sea basin, a distinctive layer of marine sand deposited far inland, dating consistently to around 6,200 BCE, found at sites from Norway to Scotland to the east coast of England. For the coastal communities of Britain, the tsunami arrives without warning. The North Sea has no deep ocean warning system. The wave would have been preceded by the sea withdrawing rapidly from the coastline, a phenomenon that people with no knowledge of tsunamis would have found bewildering or perhaps drawn toward rather than away from, followed by a surge that struck whatever was at the coast with a force and speed that left no time for response. 2 confirmed Mesolithic archaeological sites lie directly beneath the tsunami deposit layer in Britain. They represent human activity that was simply ended, covered, and preserved by the wave. The number of unconfirmed sites is unknown. Some estimates suggest the Storegga tsunami killed up to a quarter of Britain's Mesolithic population, a figure that reflects both the scale of the wave and the fact that these are coastal and riverine people whose camps and settlements are concentrated exactly where the damage was greatest. A total Mesolithic British population of perhaps 2,000 to 5,000 people losing a quarter in a single event is a catastrophe of the first order. Small populations absorb individual deaths badly. The loss of entire coastal communities, the knowledge they held, the social bonds they maintained, the exchange networks they anchored, reverberates across the surviving population in ways that are difficult to quantify but impossible to dismiss. The Doggerbank communities, if any survived the tsunami, were living on borrowed time regardless. By around 5000 BCE, the Doggerbank itself disappears beneath the waves. The final remnant of the world that once connected Britain to Europe, swallowed by a sea that now covers it at depths shallow enough to fish, but too deep to see the ground. The fishing trawlers that work these waters today still pull up its traces. Barbed antler harpoon points, flint blades, animal bones, and occasionally human remains, dragged from the seabed in nets, brought to the surface after thousands of years of darkness, and for the most part disposed of before anyone realizes what they are. The genetic consequences of Britain's severance from Europe are visible in the ancient DNA record. The Western hunter-gatherer gene pool in Britain shows increasing differentiation from its continental counterpart across the later Mesolithic, a pattern consistent with the reduction in gene flow that the end of the land connection imposed. The exchange relationships that had carried Baltic amber to Somerset and continental tool technologies to Britain thin out. They do not stop entirely. Boats continue to cross the Channel and the Irish Sea. But the scale diminishes, and the British Mesolithic population becomes progressively more genetically distinct from the mainland European populations it was once continuous with. Island life, once imposed by geology, begins to shape the biology of the people who live it. The boats that maintain contact across the new waters are not well preserved in the archaeological record, but they existed. If people are living on the islands of Scotland, Ireland, and the Hebrides throughout the Mesolithic, islands that required sea crossings to reach. The same communities exploiting offshore seal colonies and deep coastal waters were navigating in craft capable of handling open water in conditions that the waters around Britain regularly produce. The channel crossing between Britain and France is roughly 34 kilometers at its narrowest point, roughly the same distance as the crossing to some of the Scottish islands that Mesolithic people were already using regularly. It was not trivial. It was not impossible. What the severing ultimately does to the people of Mesolithic Britain is impose a different relationship with the world beyond the horizon. Before the flooding, Britain was connected, part of a continental network of exchange, the knowledge and gene flow that stretched from the Atlantic coast to the plains of Central Europe. After it, Britain is an island with everything that implies a bounded territory, a finite resource base, a population that must sustain itself within the limits of what the island holds. The Mesolithic people who live through the transition do not know that Britain will remain an island for all of recorded history and beyond. They only know that the crossing is harder than it was, that the people on the other side are further away, and that the world they inherited from their grandparents has become, by the measure of a single lifetime, considerably smaller. The scale of what was lost under the North Sea is something archaeology is only beginning to measure. Europe's Lost Frontiers, the University of Bradford project, led by Vince Gaffney, has used seismic survey data to reconstruct over 40,000 square kilometers of Doggerland's former landscape in digital form, mapping ancient river channels, lake basins, coastal lagoons, and the topography of a world that supported human life for thousands of years, and that is now under up to 40 meters of water. What those maps reveal is not an empty transit corridor, but a rich and varied landscape that was, by every ecological measure, prime Mesolithic territory. The people who lived there were not marginal. They were central. Their world did not decline. It drowned. By around 8000 BCE, the people of Mesolithic Britain have been living in a post-glacial world for nearly 4,000 years. 4,000 years is a long time to adapt. The panic, if there was ever panic, of inheriting a changing landscape is long resolved. What exists now is something that took generations to build, a deep, specific, place-grounded knowledge of a forested island that functions as a complete and sustainable world. The Mesolithic at its height is not a world in transition. It is a world in full expression, operating on its own terms, asking nothing from what comes before or after it. The forest at this point covers most of Britain in a dense, layered canopy of oak, elm, lime, hazel, and alder that would shade out a modern walker within minutes of leaving a clearing. These are not the managed woodlands of the medieval period or the plantation forests of today. They are ancient woodland in the truest sense. Old-growth stands where individual trees have been standing for centuries, where the ground layer is deep in leaf mold and root systems, where the light on a summer afternoon filters through in shifting columns that illuminate and conceal simultaneously. Moving through this forest efficiently requires a spatial memory and a reading of subtle signs that takes a lifetime to develop. The people who have developed that reading are extraordinary navigators of their own world. The flint scatters found at Mesolithic sites across Britain tell a story of movement that covers hundreds of miles. Stone, sourced from specific geological outcrops appearing at sites far from its origin, not as trade goods brought in bulk, but as individual tools carried in personal kits across long distances. A flint blade from the chalk downs of southern England found at a site in the Pennines did not travel there by accident. Someone carried it, used it, and left it at a campfire hundreds of miles from where it was made. The territories these people ranged across are vast and intimately known. The Boldner cliff site off the Isle of Wight, now submerged beneath the Solent, produced a finding in 2015 that reframes what we thought we knew about the late Mesolithic. Sedimentary ancient DNA recovered from the waterlogged Paleosol. Ancient soil preserved under the rising sea contained wheat DNA dated to around 6000 BCE, roughly 2,000 years before wheat appears anywhere else in mainland Britain. The researchers who published the finding in Science suggested that sophisticated social networks linked the Mesolithic communities of Northern Europe to the farming frontier advancing from the south. The people of Mesolithic Britain were not isolated from the transformations happening on the continent. They were in contact, aware of what was coming, and in at least some cases obtaining its products without adopting its practices. The Howick House in Northumberland adds another layer to the picture of how these people lived. Excavated between 2000 and 2002 by a team from Newcastle University, it is a large circular post-built structure dated to around 7600 BCE. Slightly younger than Starkar's house, but significantly larger. The post holes suggest a structure perhaps 6 meters in diameter, capable of comfortably housing an extended family group. Charred hazelnut shells, fish bones, and animal remains in the floor deposits indicate sustained occupation across multiple seasons, possibly year-round. At Howick, Mesolithic Britain stops being a world of nomads and becomes, at least in some places, a world of people who chose to stay. The range of environments these people occupy by the later Mesolithic is the fullest expression of their adaptive capacity. Sites are now found from the Scilly Isles to the northern tip of Scotland, from coastal headlands to upland moorland. A Mesolithic site discovered near Scarborough in 2023 by teams from the universities of Chester and Manchester, dated to around 10,500 years ago, sits on the former shore of a lake island in what is now deep peat, preserved in extraordinary condition, yielding bone, antler, and wood alongside the flint assemblage. Now, the site's excavators noted that the animal bones showed deliberate cut marks and processing patterns, consistent not just with food preparation, but with the careful extraction of specific materials, sinew, bone marrow, specific joints, in ways that reflect a precise and practiced knowledge of each animal's anatomy and utility. The knowledge system underpinning all of this accumulated, refined and transmitted across 4,000 years of post-glacial adaptation, is operating at its fullest and most efficient by the later Mesolithic. Every plant that flowers in the British forest has been tasted, tested, processed, and categorized by someone in this population's history. Every animal's seasonal movements, mating behaviors, preferred habitats, and responses to hunting pressure are known in the kind of detail that only comes from sustained, multi-generational observation. The rivers and their fish runs, the coastal beds and their seasonal productivity, the upland routes and their grazing patterns, all of it is mapped in human memory, updated each season, and passed forward in the stories and demonstrations that constitute these people's entire educational system. There is a temptation in describing any prehistoric people to reach for the word simple, and it is worth resisting that temptation directly. The Mesolithic people of Britain are not simple. They are differently complex from modern people in ways that are worth naming. They carry no writing, no mathematics, no metallurgy, no domesticated crops. What they carry instead is a depth of ecological knowledge, a practical competence across a range of physical skills, and a social intelligence calibrated to small group interdependence that modern people have largely outsourced to institutions, technology, and the division of labor. Neither system is superior. They are solutions to different problems, developed under different constraints. The Mesolithic solution sustained human life in Britain for 4,000 years without measurably degrading the environment that supported it. That is a track record that deserves to be named plainly. The exchange networks of the later Mesolithic carry materials across distances that confirm a connected social world, operating at a scale larger than individual bands. Baltic amber has been found at Mesolithic sites in southern Britain, and Portland chert from the Dorset coast appears at sites in Wales and the north of England. Cullen stone from northeast Scotland was carried south and east. These movements are not random. They follow the logic of exchange relationships between people who know each other, who meet seasonally, who maintain obligations across distance that are renewed through the circulation of materials. The amber that arrives in Somerset from the Baltic has passed through many hands, each exchange marking and renewing a relationship in the chain. This is not trade in the modern sense. It is the material expression of a social network maintained deliberately across the full breadth of the island. And somewhere in the later Mesolithic, the precise timing is debated. The first signs of what will eventually become agriculture begin appearing in the British record. Not farming, not domesticated animals or cultivated crops, but the earliest traces of contact with a world where those things exist. The Boldner Cliff wheat, DNA. Possible management of specific plant species at sites in Ireland. The charcoal burning patterns that suggest deliberate landscape intervention on a scale larger than incidental campfires. These are not the actions of people who have adopted farming. They are the actions of people who are aware of it, experimenting with it at its edges, deciding, and for the time being, that their own system works better than the alternative being practiced across the water. For several centuries at least, they are right. Farming arrives in Britain around 4000 BCE. That is where this video ends, because what happens when farming arrives, how the Mesolithic world contracts, who the farmers are, what the genetic evidence shows about replacement and survival, belongs to the next chapter of this series. This section is not about that arrival. It is about the people who are here when it happens, what they have built, who they are at the moment the world changes again, and what it means that they sustained a complete and sophisticated way of life on this island for 4,000 years without once needing anything that comes after them. The Mesolithic population of Britain at the moment farming arrives is estimated at somewhere between 2,500 and 5,000 people. That is the entire human population of an island, roughly 200,000 square kilometers in size. In the places where the evidence is richest, the river valleys of Yorkshire, the coastal margins of Wales and Scotland, the wetland edges of the Mendips, those people have been living for generations in a relationship with specific stretches of land so deep that it has shaped both the landscape and themselves. They know this island the way modern people know a language, not as something learned and applied, but as something lived in so completely that its patterns operate below the level of conscious thought. The last Mesolithic woman whose genome has been analyzed in Britain died less than 500 years before farming appears in the archaeological record. Her ancestry is entirely local. No signal of contact with the continental farming populations that were already practicing agriculture 1,000 miles to the south and east. The 2019 Nature Ecology and Evolution study that reported this result noted it with some surprise. Given that farming had been established in adjacent parts of continental Europe for over 1,000 years before it reached Britain, the absence of admixture in the latest British Mesolithic sample suggests these communities were maintaining clear boundaries, cultural and biological, with the farming world pressing against their horizon. Why did farming take so long to reach Britain? The island's geography is part of the answer. The channel crossing raised the practical barrier that the land connection had eliminated. But geography alone does not explain a 1,000-year delay. The Boulder Cliff wheat DNA suggests that Mesolithic Britons knew about farming, had obtained its products, and had chosen not to adopt its practices. The evidence from the cairngorms, from the Oronsay middens, from the woodland burning patterns across Britain describes a population that was managing its landscape actively and feeding itself reliably from a system that had worked for 4,000 years. The case for switching was not obvious. There is a tendency in popular history to frame the arrival of farming as an unambiguous improvement. More food, more stability, the beginning of civilization. The skeletal evidence tells a more complicated story. Mesolithic individuals in Britain show good general health by prehistoric standards, strong bones, low rates of dental decay, evidence of a varied and nutritionally complete diet. The earliest Neolithic farmers in Britain and across Europe show a different profile. Increased rates of dental caries from starchy diets, a reduced stature compared to their hunter-gatherer predecessors, higher rates of infectious disease consistent with denser settlements and close contact with domestic animals. Farming produces more calories per acre. It does not automatically produce better health. What farming does produce, above all else, is more people. A settled farming community on a fixed area of land can sustain a much higher population density than a mobile band of hunter-gatherers ranging across the same territory. As farming populations grew across Europe, the relative demographic balance shifted, not through violence necessarily, but through sheer weight of numbers. The ancient DNA evidence from the British Neolithic transition is unambiguous. The incoming farmers, carrying ancestry ultimately derived from Anatolia via Iberia. I replaced the Mesolithic population so thoroughly that the hunter-gatherer contribution to the Neolithic British gene pool is almost undetectable. The 2019 study found no resurgence of Western hunter-gatherer ancestry at any point in the British Neolithic, suggesting the replacement was rapid, thorough, and essentially complete within a few generations of the farmer's arrival. What is lost in this replacement goes well beyond genetics. The 4,000 years of ecological knowledge that the Mesolithic population had accumulated, the specific, place-grounded understanding of the British forest, its animals, its seasonal rhythms, its productive margins, is not transferable to incoming farmers whose entire framework is built around a different relationship with the land. The language dies. The stories die. Yet the knowledge of which plants flower when, which river stretches hold fish in which season, which upland routes the deer use in autumn, All of it either dies with the people who held it or survives only in fragments, absorbed into the practices of the farming communities that displaced them. The forest itself begins disappearing almost immediately as the farmers clear it for fields. Within a few centuries of the Neolithic arrival, Britain's ancient wildwood is being dismantled in ways it will never fully recover from. In Western Scotland, the genetic evidence shows something different from the rest of Britain. At least 2 early Neolithic individuals from this region carried detectable levels of local Western hunter-gatherer ancestry, suggesting that in the west and north, one where the farming frontier arrived later and where the landscape suited hunter-gatherer subsistence better than agriculture, the Mesolithic communities persisted longer and mixed more substantially with the incoming population. The margins are always where the old worlds survive longest. It is a pattern that repeats throughout British prehistory, the highlands and western coasts as refugia for ways of life that the lowlands have already abandoned. The Mesolithic people of Britain do not disappear in a dramatic confrontation. There is no confirmed evidence of systematic violence at the Mesolithic-Neolithic transition in Britain. No massacre sites, no battle burials, no weaponry distributions that suggest organized conflict. What the genetics describe instead is absorption and displacement through demographic pressure. A small population gradually overwhelmed by a larger one, the two mixing at the margins, but the larger always dominating, the smaller contributing less and less to the gene pool with each successive generation until the signal effectively disappears. It is a quiet ending, leaving almost no direct trace in either the genetic record or the landscape, which is itself part of what makes it so complete. This video began with a world in transformation, a landscape changing faster than the people living in it could fully adapt. It ends with those people at their fullest expression, having adapted completely, having built something durable and sophisticated from the raw material of a post-glacial island. What they built did not survive the next transformation, but it existed fully and for a long time, and it deserves to be understood on its own terms rather than purely as prologue to what came after. If you want to understand where those Mesolithic people came from, the Ice Age ancestors who first walked into Britain 40,000 years ago, who painted horses in the dark and buried their dead in red ochre, that story is in the first video in this series. And if you want to follow what happens when the farmers arrive, when the last hunter-gatherers make their final stand in the forests and on the western coasts, that story is coming next.